Hello and welcome to Transformation Ground Control Podcast. I'm here with Priest and Noble. You can listen to us on YouTube every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, U.S. time, 3 p.m. London time, or 11 p.m. Hong Kong time. You can also find us after that time every week on Google, Apple, Spotify, Pandora, whatever your podcast platform of choice is. So thanks for listening or watching in. Our next guest I'm excited for, it's Marcus Harris, and we actually had him on our first episode 1 of Transformation Ground Control. And in that episode, if you haven't watched it or listened to it, if you go back and listen, it's a really interesting conversation where we talk about contract negotiations. And this is a topic that we're going to talk about today that has the risk of being a sort of a buzzkill, if you will. We're talking about transformation failures, and on the surface, that sounds scary and something we may not want to talk about, but there's a lot of great lessons we get from some of these failures, especially when you look at it from an attorney's perspective. You know, someone who's trained to think about risk and mitigating risk, and in some cases assigning blame, when something goes wrong, or making allegations in that way. And so Marcus is someone I've worked with over the years as an expert witness. I've been an expert witness on a few of his cases, and I certainly have my own opinions on what causes failures, and have opined on that in cases. But today we want to get an attorney's perspective, get his perspective on not only why these projects fail, but most importantly, what could companies be doing differently and be doing better to hedge against the risk of failure, or at least to mitigate some of those risks, not just from a legal perspective, but also just from an organizational project management perspective too. He's got a really good handle on things even outside the legal realm of what causes some of these failures. So excited to have Marcus on the show. Marcus, thanks for joining today.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Eric. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So Marcus, you and I have worked together on a few different failures and lawsuits in the past, and I've been an expert witness for some of your cases. But I always get involved a bit later in the process, after legal action has been filed, whereas you're kind of on the front line when the initial contact is made or the initial discussion about a potential lawsuit is happening. So I guess my question for you to start is, how does, just in generally speaking, across all the cases you've worked on, what is it that happens during implementations in general that leads to lawsuit? Or in other words, how does it get that bad to get to the point where they need to call you and initiate some sort of legal action?
Yeah, well, the simple answer is it's got to get real bad, right? I mean, I think every implementation that I've been associated with, certainly from a legal side, but we come in other capacities sometimes as well. Certainly in my former life, being in-house, they're almost all difficult. And I think very rarely do they go as planned, as expected. It's likely that they're going to come in over budget, exceed whatever kind of time estimate that was initially projected. So I think it goes without saying that they're difficult. When they come to me, these clients, it's because the vendor has repeatedly said to them, I can get the software to work if you give me more money, if you give me more time, above all, give me more patience. It's going to do what we said it was going to do. You just need to be fully invested in this. And I think there's some truth to that, and I'll get into that more in a second. But it's usually just an exasperated call saying, we are just at our wits' end. We have spent millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars over budget. And it just doesn't look like there's an end in sight. A lot of times they will have some kind of a third-party consultant or some kind of third-party expert come in to just verify what was done. It's not really a post-mortem, but just verify, how far off is the vendor really getting this thing to work. Other times they'll bring in a specialty consulting firm that is supposed to right-side a project. And in connection with that right-siding, that consultant will also have done some sort of analysis. And that usually is kind of the impetus for a phone call to me. There's got to be some kind of either just, throw your hands up after just being, spending money excessively milked by the vendor, or you've wisened up, you've stopped the implementation, you have somebody else come in and give you essentially an independent verification that something was wrong. And that's usually when we would call. And I think my first response in almost every situation is, have you done everything that you can do to get this software to where you think it needs to be so that you can run the business on it? And if the answer is yes, then I say, okay, let's think about your legal options. But I think you've got to really make sure that what you've gone through is bad enough to start a lawsuit. Because it's not an easy road to go down either.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like it seems like companies get in so far over their heads and they keep doubling down trying to fix things, and at some point they reach that tipping point where, hey, despite the pain of a lawsuit or filing legal action, that's going to be our best path forward, which I'm sure is a tough decision for a lot of companies to make.
Yeah, no, I think it's an incredibly tough decision. The cost outlay that you're looking at in an ERP lawsuit in particular, and make no mistake about it, this is complex commercial litigation. This is not, something like a slip and fall where there's a finite moment and there's witnesses and there's easily obtainable evidence. I mean, this is sometimes, months, years of an implementation process and a sales process, and for that, an evaluation process. All of that's got to be gone through in extreme detail by a number of lawyers looking for what we call hot documents and documents of evidence, where this thing went off the rails and whose fault it was. So the cost associated with something is just enormous. And it has to make sense financially, and for it to make sense financially, you as the customer have to have been damaged pretty badly. It's exponential to some extent. I think when you're looking at a damages analysis from an ERP failure, you're not just looking at the cost that you spent on failed software that's unusable. It's where you would be today had that software actually worked, had it done what it was supposed to have. It's all the time, expense, and effort that your team put into it. It's all the hardware that you bought, all the third-party software that you purchased. And now, because you're going to walk away from it, you've got to do it all over again. And the goal of any lawsuit like this is to recover as much of that as we can to get that customer whole.
Right. And whether or not they're able to recover or be happy with those results is I assume a whole nother story.
Yeah, and that's one of the most important questions when you're deciding whether to move forward after a failure, a lawsuit is, well, what does success look like to you? How do you define a successful outcome? For some people, that's just, we're going to go guns blazing, we're going to be aggressive, we're going to take this to a jury trial, and we're going to make them feel as much pain as possible. That typically is not a rational way to go. And I think, if you're thinking that way as a customer, it's been wrong, you need to take a step back and look at this from a logical, rational business perspective. What's the cost-benefit analysis? How much is it going to cost? What's the likely outcome from a dollar perspective? What are you going to get out of this? And does it make sense to put that cash outlay on attorney's fees, given the likelihood of whatever outcome you deem to be successful?
Right. So when you're looking at these lawsuits, and I've worked with you on a number of these, like I said, where you go into these cases and you see just a whole host of problems. I mean, it's usually not just one thing or one problem. It's just a mess of stuff happening. But when you really peel back the onion and get to the root cause of it, a lot of times it comes down to a handful of things that are causing all the other symptoms or problems. But if you had to summarize some of the cases you've been involved with over the years, I mean, what are those most common things that come to mind that are those common root causes for all the other pain that they might be feeling throughout the transformation?
Yeah, this is kind of a mantra that I repeat. And I know we had another podcast and brought this concept up last time, and I'll bring it up again. And these things fail usually not because of a technology issue. It's generally the software works. Now, it may not work for you. It may not work as represented. It may not work in your environment, but that software company is going to be able to trot out hundreds of thousands of customers around the world that have used that software successfully. And that is, a challenging thing to overcome in a lawsuit. But, the question is, what do we see? What leads to failure? What are the common themes? And I think fundamentally, like I said the day when we had it, is it's almost always a people issue. Okay, it's a failure to manage the process properly. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And I think we can mitigate that through proper contract negotiation and documenting what's supposed to happen, milestones, deadlines, change orders, and that kind of thing. That's certainly important, but there's always these conflicting motives, right? That just naturally come into play. And I think as a customer, you want this thing implemented as cheaply as possible, as fast as possible, and you want to get the most out of it that you possibly can. The vendor's goal is really kind of the polar opposite of that, and that's let's get in there. Let's do a lot of customizations, modifications. Let's make this thing sing for this customer. That's all fine and good, but the problem with that is they're incented by the number of hours that they work, the number of modifications, the number of customizations that they do, and above all, really, how long this project takes. If the longer the better to some extent. I don't want to paint all vendors with the same brush. Certainly not all of them are bad, but we do see these reoccurring issues, themes. And I think when you've got a situation like an implementation where the goals are diametrically opposed, the situation is ripe for misunderstanding, and that's kind of the breeding ground for implementation failures that we see pretty much.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's the people side of it is one of those things that a lot of times companies don't think about and the teams don't think about because they get so caught up in the technology itself and just trying to get the software itself to work that it's easy to overlook the people challenges and the softer side of it.
Yeah, and I think if you overlook that, you really are putting one arm behind your back. You're really going to make it much more difficult to be successful for long term. Not even only just for duration of that implementation project, but for the resulting product that comes out of it. It may not fully meet your expectations or your requirements.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So here's a loaded question for you then. So I know you've worked on both sides of the equation in terms of plaintiff, the company that's suing someone, and then the defendant, the one that's defending themselves against the plaintiff, which is usually the software vendor or the system integrator that's being sued. But in your experience, who's most commonly at fault? Is there a party that you prefer to represent or that you feel more comfortable representing because you feel like the other party is going to be more likely to be at fault? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and look, I'll tell you, I started my career primarily representing software. Okay, so I've got a pretty good understanding of software vendor tactics, integrator tactics, and really what the expectations are with respect to implementation on the vendor side. Later in my career, and it wasn't necessarily a conscious decision, it just kind of happened over time. We started representing licensees, the customers, against the software vendors. And so I think I can fairly say that in almost any implementation project that we've been involved in, there's blame to go around. Like there's a legitimate finger to be pointed at parties, and maybe even more. There are other consulting companies involved. I don't know. So the simple answer to your question is there's blame everywhere. The cases that we take, we do a very good job on the front end to make sure that the customer allegations are valid, that there's a reasonable basis for making the claims that we're making, that are supported by evidence. So, to say that when we're representing customers, typically it's the vendor that's at fault. Like I said, it may not be a technology issue that is the impetus of the failure, but it could be, maybe it wasn't done with ill intent, but overselling of the software, minimizing the software shortcomings, the need or desire to break out into a particular industry where the software may not have been used before. We see that kind of stuff happen all the time. It's software is massively oversold. The salespeople don't care. They're there to sell the sizzle, right? And when you get a hamburger and you thought you were getting filet mignon, you're going to have a problem. I think certainly cases we deal with, it's almost always the vendor that has done something. The software did not live up to the representations that were made by the salespeople. The salespeople were incented by bonuses. They had to make their numbers. Didn't really fully vet what the business requirements were that were presented, or they didn't care, they didn't understand them. So those are the types of things that we see in almost every case that we deal with. So.
Right. Yeah. And one of the challenges of these sorts of cases, and I'm certainly obviously not an attorney and I don't get involved in other things outside of the transformation or digital transformation space, but it seems like these sorts of projects would be a bit more gray in terms of the who's right and wrong, just because there's so many variables and complexities and things that go into making these projects successful. Unlike, for example, I know you do intellectual property and other types of law practice that might be a bit more cut and dry. But in these sorts of cases, it's common that we are involved in expert witness reporting and depositions and testimony where we can't really pin the blame on one party or solely on one party. Oftentimes it's kind of a mix of things that merge together to create these problems, and usually it's not squarely on one party.
That's well said. And the goal in any one of these cases is you've got to find the ticket, right? There's going to be a point at which decisions that were made you could not recover from. And like I said, there's going to be decisions on the customer side that were poor, and there were decisions on the vendor side that, and it's hard because it is very much a great, is it a misrepresentation for the vendor to say, well, yeah, the software can do that? They don't tell you that their view is that software can do anything with enough modifications, and that actually is probably true. But what they're not telling you is it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to customize the software in that way.
Well, good. Well, when we come back, we're going to take a quick break. I want to ask you about your most memorable lawsuit that you've been involved with and see what kind of lessons we could take away from that. And we'll get back to the questions here in just a second. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
All right, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Marcus Harris talking about digital transformation and enterprise technology, lawsuits and failures. And Marcus, we were talking a bit before the break about some of the challenges that you commonly see in these sorts of projects and whose fault it is and that sort of thing. But I guess if we dig down a little bit deeper and look at one specific example, what is, if you have one, what is the most memorable lawsuit that you've been involved with, either because it was such a big disaster or it's just so unique, or is there anything that stands out as without mentioning, obviously, the confidential names of the parties and that sort of thing, and who won and all that good stuff?
I've got a few. It's hard to pick because there's big players like SAP or smaller players. I won't name names. Some of them are massively high dollar. These failures are enormous. But the one that stands out most to me as being most unique, and this is one that you were actually involved in, an expert witness perspective. It was a case that involved software that was meant to essentially track atmospheric gas canisters. There's more to it than that. Fundamentally, that's what it was, and apparently that was a very unique, unusual thing for software to do. Just the process by which it was sold. It was leased, and then it came back, and it was always owned. And it was an unusual way to kind of divvy up product and manage product. And fundamentally, the software couldn't function the way that it had been represented by the software. But that in and of itself isn't unusual. But what was really unusual, I think you've got to point some blame at the customer here, is that the customer viewed software implementations as being as simple as turning on a light. Okay, and their view of the process was, we don't want to be involved at all. We want minimal involvement. We don't have the time. We don't have the resources, nor do we have the desire to become experts on some kind of technological system that's not within our wheelhouse. And so what we are going to do is cede ownership of this project, essentially, to the software vendor. The software vendor in this case was also the integrator. And so you can imagine how that ended up. The integrator basically had free reign to run amok, billing and hours. It was like a sailor, a drunken sailor on a dock with swigging billable hours, and staggering. It was just milking the client like you would not believe.
It's a very, very vivid analogy there.
It's a vivid case. Don't get me going. And so, the client was in a unique industry vertical that the software vendor really wanted to get into, and the software vendor really had no understanding of the nuances of that particular industry. And they had designed and developed their base software. Well, let me step back. They took their base software that was really not designed for that industry at all. They hired some industry experts of dubious reputation and dubious skill set to come in and tell them how that industry worked. And then they modified the software based on those representations. And it really was so idiosyncratic that it just didn't work. This thing was just a nightmare. It went on forever. Massive legal fees, massive liability. It was a tough case for them, but it was a fun case too.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point around, when we think about risk and the probability of failure, and most people don't want to think that way, and you don't want to be overly negative and go in total defense, but it's a lot easier to think about risk and play defense early on rather than waiting until we get to that tipping point that you talked about earlier. But it seems like that the more complex, the more unique, and the more just unique, I guess is probably the best word. The more unique the company is, either it's because they're in a unique industry or within their industry they're very unique. It seems like there's just a higher likelihood of failure because you're straining the norm, if you will. You're straining what technology can usually do, and you're probably imposing more change on your organization that's creating a whole other set of risks and challenges. Would you agree with that, or do you see any patterns there? I don't have any data to back this. It's just more of a qualitative observation, but do you see anything similar to that in the patterns of what you've seen?
Yeah, I think if you've got a really unique industry that doesn't do business like other people do business, then the likelihood that your implementation is going to fail, that software is not going to be suited to you, is really pretty high. And so, yeah, we do see that. It's someone's got a very unique process, or the product set is just so unusual. We had a case with a large wire manufacturer and distributor, and essentially, the product came in as product A, and then they twisted it, dyed it, and did some other things to it, sold it in different sizes, and that piece of wire had to be tracked from the moment it came into the company to whatever spools it had been put on, and then divided out to the airplane that it was in, because it was that critical of a piece of product. In this standard software, which is a software vendor that we all know, just couldn't do it. So that's not the same case. It's a different case, but it was a unique application of how that company did business that was unlike a standard manufacturer or distributor, and the software just really wasn't well suited to that environment at all. So I totally.
Yeah. So along those same lines, then, as we're talking about risk, then, and we're talking about defense, and how can we proactively avoid the need to have to hire someone like you later on? What are some of the biggest things that you would recommend to companies to avoid failure in the first place, so they don't get to that tipping point that you mentioned before?
Yeah, yeah, that's a tough question because there's so many things, right? But I think fundamentally, you've got to have realistic expectations about what is right in front of you, about what you're getting into. Because if you think that this is going to be like a light switch going on and off, and you're not going to have any involvement in the process, you're sorely mistaken, and you're setting yourself up for failure. Um, you know, if you're going to try to not adapt to the software and pay for a whole bunch of customizations or modifications to the code to make that software look and function like your legacy software system, that's not a good place to be either, right? So I think flexibility, understanding what you're getting into, and having realistic expectations as to what the cost, the involvement, and the impact is going to be in your business of that implementation, and what is a realistic outcome for you from the implementation. It's not a panacea, right? And it's not going to be able to. There's going to be functionality gaps, and you've got to be able to figure out what those gaps are early on, if you can deal with them, and how to get around them in a reasonable manner. So I think that's the biggest thing that we see. I think people that fail, just have unrealistic expectations, whether it's a technology expectation or whether it's a process expectation. Is that key into kind of what you see as well?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you hit a really important one, which is that the first thing you mentioned around unrealistic expectations. I think so many problems are caused by the fact that if I'm implementing, I just, for whatever reason, whether it's my fault or not is a whole nother story, but I have unrealistic expectations. I think this is going to be as easy as flipping a switch. And and I blame the vendors largely for that, because I think that's part of their sales messaging, and especially with the advent of the cloud and cloud technology and just general advancements in technology, it becomes almost like it's a selling point that, hey, this is going to be super easy and it's not going to be that complex, and we've taken the risk out of your implementation. And if I buy into that and I set my plan and my budget and my resource commitments and all that stuff based on unrealistic expectations, I'm gonna end up making a bunch of bad decisions later on, because I have to, because now I'm out of money, I'm out of resources, I'm out of time, because I drew a line in the sand based on faulty assumptions. So I agree with that. That's one of the biggest, if not, you could argue that's probably the biggest root cause, at least of what we see with failure.
Yeah, I do too. And I think one of the ways to mitigate that is to just kind of benchmark where companies of your size have been, what not only what they've spent, what the outcome was, how involved they were. It's not easy to get that information, but I think companies that take that extra step to really have an understanding of what they're more successful than.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit a really important point, is it should be based on actual results, not just past proposals that the sales rep has done for other companies like yours, because those proposals may be just as flawed as the one they're offering to you.
Yeah, and you've got to do your own research too, because a vendor will say, "Well, don't worry about that. We're going to take you out to for site visits to customers that have implemented the software that are in your industry, that are similar size, they're wildly successful." That is a little bit deceptive. Now, a lot of times, what you don't realize is that those customers are hosting you on site because they're getting discounts on their software, so they're incented to tell you positive things and upsell that software. You know, so we see that happen pretty regularly, and a lot of times, the way a particular one of these customer sample customers, I guess, uses the software may have really no relation to the way that you use it. Your business might be different, might be similar, it might be in the same industry, but what you need may not be what they need. They may not be even using the same type of functionality that's critical to you. So they have no idea whether that piece of that product actually works well. So
Right. Yeah. So if I'm on a project team or part of an organization that's going through a transformation right now, and I'm starting to see signs of trouble? And this is a tough question because everyone's going to see signs of trouble. You're going to run into hiccups and roadblocks and challenges and things you've got to work through. But at some point, you know that trouble starts to build up and snowball, and like you said before, you reach that tipping point, and then you're at that point of no return where you've got to do something more drastic, like potentially file legal action. But if I start to see trouble, I mean, what do I do? How do I right size things? How do I get things back on track? How do I, even when things start to get a little difficult, how do I avoid the need to end up in litigation?
Well, I think this is where good project management comes into play, at least from my perspective. What we try to do in almost every contract that we draft, put a robust project management paragraph or provision, some language detailing what happens when there's an issue. How is that issue escalated? So that's one piece of it, and I think you've got to have some sort of really solid change management process so that you know exactly, okay, well, that's not going the way that you're supposed to go. What do we do now? Right? Let's stop, assess, figure out how this is going to impact the overall project. So that's another thing too. But I also think you have to have insight into the project. And if you don't have a contractual obligation on that vendor to provide you standard project status updates and the tools for you to have some transparency into what's really going on, so that's going to be problematic because then you're not even going to see problems that happen. So, and there's a whole other discussion as to how they draft these project status updates, what they actually tell you, if anything, how helpful they are to you. But those are the typical tools, and you want to make sure that you have a contractual obligation on the vendor in your agreements for them to be using those processes. Because if not, you're not even going to know there's a problem. So it's really, I go back to this concept a lot. It's trying to leverage that contract negotiation process and the resulting agreement as a management tool to mitigate the likelihood that there are going to be problems. Or at the very least, if there are problems, have a process in place to deal with that everybody has already agreed upon. Because you don't want surprises. And I think you can't contract for every eventuality or every possibility, but you've got to give yourself a dog in the fight. And if you've got an experienced attorney, or even, it doesn't even matter, attorney, if they're a contract specialist, contract negotiator, someone that's really skilled, that's gone through this multiple times, knows what to put into the statements of work, contract, manage the process. That's what you need. If you don't have that, I don't know how you're going to do it.
Yeah, and it's almost like you have to have you have to be able to straddle the line between being optimistic and having a clear vision and wanting to do things right, but then at the same time having this little mechanism in your brain that says, okay, I also have to look at the downside or the negative side of things. And I think a lot of times when companies start these projects, they get so enamored by the possibilities and the technology and all the great things that could come of this, which is good. You don't want to lose sight of that, but you also don't want to be blinded to the fact that you've got risk. You mentioned before, no system is perfect, especially if you're a unique business or you have complex operations. You're inevitably going to strain the system. The transformation is going to be a strain on the organization. And not to say that you shouldn't do it, but you should recognize that there are risks there, and we need to figure out how we're going to mitigate those risks. So I think that's where a lot of people, the human spirit being more optimistic than not, I think oftentimes you get blinded by the fact that, yeah, you could be optimistic, have a vision, try to do things right, but also recognize you're not going to do everything right. You're going to have challenges. What do you do? How do you identify those risks before they become too much of a problem?
Absolutely. I think the problem that I see a lot is people don't want to think that way, right? Because you'll do these implementation projects can be huge, right? You've got a really big one going on now, where there's just multiple third-party pieces of software that complement the SAP system. And, we're dealing with not only high-end, people in the IT department, the technology department, client, but we're dealing, with kind of lower-end people, HR people, and these people have been tasked with kind of managing a small piece of the implementation because it's a particular module or some specific type of product that is for their department. And they're so enamored with the technology and they're so excited about it. They just want to get the contract signed and they want to get going. You know, you've got to be the guy that says, well, hold on, here are all the horrible things that can happen, but people discount it. And they say, oh, that's not going to happen to us. Or, no, we don't need to deal with that. Let's just get the contract signed. It's only a $100,000 piece of software, and we don't want to spend the money to negotiate the contract because it's a low risk. You know, that kind of thinking of it back to what you meant. You need to put time in on the front to avoid putting the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree with you. And it's a good place to leave it too. I think that if there's one takeaway, it's probably that, you know, you need to take the time to really go in with your eyes wide open and see the blind spots, but also obviously see the good stuff that'll come from the transformation as well. Good. Well, thanks for being here, Marcus. How do people get a hold of you? How can we find you? How can we learn more about you?
Yeah, you can send me an email at mharris@taflaw.com. That's my website as well. TAFLaw, large US-based law firm that does a variety of things, not just technology law, software law. Harris@taflaw is the best way to get hold.
Great. Well, thanks for being here. Appreciate your time and look forward to chatting with you soon.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks, Marcus.